"Don't drink it," someone whispered, but no one moved, not yet, not under that Mississippi sun that pressed down like a hand you couldn't shake off, the air thick and unmoving, cicadas screaming from the trees as if the world itself was warning them to wait, and Anna Weiss stood there holding the glass, watching the foam rise slowly to the rim, pale and alive, nothing like anything she had seen before, nothing like water, nothing like coffee, nothing like the thin soups that had kept them alive. These past months, it looked almost celebratory, and that was the problem, because nothing in her life had felt like celebration for a very long time, not since the trains, not since the camps, not since she learned to measure trust in silence instead of words, and around her the other women stood just as still, 6 of them in faded gray uniforms, boots dusted red from the road, shoulders tight, eyes fixed not on the drink but on the man who had brought it, Thomas Carter, standing 10 feet away with his hat pulled low against the sun, saying nothing, offering no explanation, just watching the way a man watches weather, patient, waiting to see what will happen next, and Anna could feel it, that space between them, not anger, not even fear exactly, but distance, the kind that comes from everything you've been told, everything you've survived, everything that taught you the enemy does not give gifts. The enemy does not bring sweetness in a glass, and yet here it was, cold to the touch, condensation sliding down the sides, catching the light in a way that felt almost unreal, and she could hear the others now, low voices in German, sharp and uncertain. "Champagne," one said, half in disbelief, half in warning, another shook her head quickly, "No, no, it's wrong, because champagne belonged to another world, a world of quiet rooms and clean dresses and laughter that didn't feel dangerous, not this place. Not here where the ground cracked under your boots and the sun burned everything down to its simplest form," and Anna didn't answer them, didn't move, she just watched the glass, then lifted her eyes slowly to the man, and he didn't look away, didn't smile, didn't gesture, just stood there with that same stillness, and in that silence something shifted, not trust, not yet. But something quieter, something that asked a question she couldn't ignore, because if it was a trick, it was a strange one, and if it was kindness, it was even stranger, and for a moment the entire field seemed to hold its breath, the insects, the heat, the 6 women frozen between hunger and memory, and Anna felt her fingers tighten slightly around the glass as the foam settled just a little lower, as if time itself was waiting for her to decide what this moment meant. Anna did not drink, not yet, because there was a difference between seeing and believing, and she had learned that lesson too well to forget it now, her fingers steady but her mind moving carefully, measuring the distance between what was offered and what was real, and the heat pressed in around them, 90 degrees or more, thick enough that every breath felt borrowed, and still the man did not speak. Thomas Carter remained where he was, boots planted in dry earth, one hand resting loosely at his side, the other holding nothing at all, as if he had already given what he came to give and the rest belonged to them, and that unsettled her more than anything, because men who wanted something usually said so, they explained, they instructed, they demanded, but this one did none of that, he simply waited, and waiting required a kind of confidence she could not immediately understand. Beside her, Elsa shifted her weight slightly. The faint sound of leather against dust, a small movement but loud in the silence. "Anna," she said quietly, not a warning, not quite a question, just her name spoken into the space between fear and curiosity, and Anna turned her head just enough to see the others, 5 pairs of eyes, all watching her now, not the drink, not the man, her, because she had been the one to step forward earlier when the girl collapsed, she had known what to do then, water, shade, breath, simple things that still worked even when the world did not, and now they were waiting again, not for orders, but for something else, something harder to name, and Anna felt that weight settle into her chest, not heavy, but present, like a hand placed gently but firmly, and she looked back at the glass. The foam had lowered slightly, leaving a thin ring along the inside, the color beneath darker now, almost like root or bark steeped in something sweet, and she wondered, briefly, how it had been made, what kind of place created something like this in the middle of heat and labor and war, and then she stopped herself, because curiosity could be dangerous if it moved too quickly, and she lifted her eyes again, meeting Thomas across the space, and this time she noticed something different. Not in his face, which remained unchanged, but in the way he stood, relaxed but not careless, as if he understood exactly what this moment required and had no intention of rushing it, and for a second, just a second, the distance between them felt smaller, not gone, but reduced, like two people standing on opposite sides of a narrow stream instead of an ocean, and Anna exhaled slowly, the air warm against her lips, and made a decision that did not feel like courage, did not feel like trust, but felt like something quieter, something practical. She lowered the glass slightly, then raised her other hand, just enough to gesture, not toward the drink, but toward him, a small motion, almost invisible, a question without words, and for the first time, Thomas moved, not forward, not closer, but enough. He stepped to the side, reached down to the wooden crate where another glass rested, identical, untouched, and he picked it up, lifted it to eye level, and paused, not for them, not for effect, but as if acknowledging the moment itself, and then he drank, one slow swallow, no hesitation, no reaction beyond the simple act of finishing what he had started, and when he lowered the glass, he did not look at them immediately. He set it back down, wiped his hand once against his pants, and only then met Anna's eyes again, and in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that the air felt different, and Anna realized that whatever this was, it was no longer just about the drink. Anna did not move right away. Even after he drank, even after the moment had shifted into something quieter and harder to ignore, because proof was not the same as permission, and she understood that better than most, her eyes stayed on him for one more second, measuring not the act itself but the absence of anything behind it, no expectation, no command, no satisfaction, just a man who had taken a drink and stepped back into stillness as if the outcome did not belong to him anymore, and that was what finally unsettled her guard, not the sweetness in the air, not the foam that had settled into a thin line along the glass, but the fact that he did not need her to accept it. Beside her Elsa let out a breath she had been holding too long, a small sound, almost lost in the hum of insects, and one of the younger women shifted again, her boots scraping softly against the dirt. "It is safe," she whispered, but her voice carried uncertainty, as if safety itself was something they no longer recognized without question, and Anna lowered her gaze to the drink once more, the surface now calmer, the bubbles slower, and she noticed the condensation on her fingers, cool against skin that had grown used to heat and dryness, a simple sensation, but one that felt out of place here, as if it belonged to another world entirely. And for a moment she remembered something she had not thought about in years, a small cafe near the river in her hometown, glass bottles sweating in the summer, the sound of distant conversation, the way ordinary life used to feel effortless and unremarkable, and the memory came and went quickly, but it left something behind, a question she could not ignore. What if not everything offered was meant to deceive? What if sometimes it was simply what it appeared to be, and the thought felt dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it asked her to reconsider something she had relied on to survive, and slowly, without announcement, she lifted the glass higher, just an inch, just enough to bring it closer, and the others fell silent again, watching her, not with pressure, but with the quiet attention of people who understood that some decisions could not be shared, and Anna inhaled once, shallow, steady, and then she tilted the glass slightly, just enough for the liquid to touch her lips, and she paused there, not drinking, not yet, letting the unfamiliar scent reach her first, something sweet, but not sharp, something warm beneath it, like roots or herbs she could not name, and then, finally, she took a small sip, not enough to commit, just enough to know, and the taste arrived differently than she expected, not bitter, not burning, not anything that matched the warning she had carried across an ocean. It was soft, almost gentle, sweetness layered over something deeper, something that lingered without demanding attention, and she swallowed slowly, her expression unchanged, but her hand no longer tightened around the glass, and for a long second she said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with the aftertaste settling into something real, something undeniable. And when she lowered the glass again, she did not look at the others first, she looked at him, and this time the distance between them felt different, not gone, not erased, but altered in a way that could not be undone, because whatever this was, it had crossed something neither of them had named, and in the silence that followed, Elsa stepped forward, just half a step, enough to reach for her own glass, and the others followed slowly, one by one, not because they trusted the drink, but because they had seen what mattered more than that, and as the first quiet sip turned into a second, and then another, the field changed in a way no one would have noticed from a distance, no sound, no movement, just 6 women standing in the heat, holding something cold, tasting something unfamiliar, and realizing that for the first time in a long while. Nothing about this moment was trying to break them. No one spoke for a while after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because whatever had just happened did not belong to words yet, it belonged to the quiet space that followed, where meaning settled slowly like dust in still air, and Anna stood with the glass still in her hand, the cold fading as the heat reclaimed it inch by inch, but she did not drink again immediately, she did not rush to repeat the moment, because the first sip had not been about taste, it had been about crossing something unseen, and crossing it once was enough for now. Beside her Elsa let out a small breath that turned into something almost like a laugh, not loud, not careless, just a soft release that seemed to surprise even her, and one of the younger women followed, lifting her glass with both hands as if it might disappear if she did not hold it carefully, and she drank more quickly than Anna had, her eyes widening slightly before she looked down at the glass again, as if confirming it was still there, still real, and the others began to move as well, not all at once, not in unison, but one by one, each making the same quiet decision in their own time, and the field, which had felt rigid and suspended just minutes before, shifted into something looser, something that allowed small sounds to return, the faint clink of glass, the soft exhale of breath, the distant rustle of leaves carried on air that had finally begun to move again, and Thomas remained where he was, watching without watching, his gaze steady but not fixed, as if he understood that this part did not require him, that whatever was unfolding belonged entirely to them, and Anna noticed the way he did not step closer, did not speak, did not claim the moment in any visible way, and that absence of ownership settled into her understanding more deeply than any gesture could have, because it meant that what they were experiencing was not something given in exchange, it was something allowed, and that distinction mattered in ways she could not yet fully explain. She lifted the glass again after a moment, this time without hesitation, taking another sip, slightly larger, and the taste remained the same, sweet but not overwhelming, layered with something she could not name but did not need to, and as she swallowed, she realized that the tension in her shoulders had eased without her noticing, not completely, not permanently, but enough that her body no longer felt like it was bracing for something unseen, and that, more than anything, felt unfamiliar, because she had grown used to holding herself in a state of readiness, always prepared, always cautious, and now, for a brief moment, that readiness had loosened its grip, and she lowered the glass slowly, looking out across the field instead of at the man this time, seeing the same rows of cotton, the same dry earth, the same sky stretched wide and empty above them, and yet something about it looked different, not because the place had changed, but because her position within it had shifted, just slightly, just enough to alter the way it felt, and she understood then that this moment would not announce itself as important, it would not mark itself with anything dramatic or obvious, it would simply exist, quiet and unremarkable on the surface, but carrying something beneath it that would stay long after the taste was gone, and when she finally looked back at Thomas, she did not nod, did not speak, did not offer any sign that could be named as gratitude, but her gaze held for a fraction longer than before, steady, direct, and in that brief exchange, something passed between them that neither of them would ever need to explain, because it was already understood in the only way that mattered. The moment did not end, it simply stretched into the next one, as if time itself had decided not to interrupt what had quietly begun, and the women returned to their work without being told, without needing instruction, their movements slower at first, not from exhaustion but from something else, something that lingered just beneath the surface, and Anna moved back into the row of cotton, her hands reaching out automatically, fingers brushing against the dry fibers, the routine familiar, almost mechanical, yet different now in a way she could not fully name, because her mind was not entirely on the work anymore. Part of it remained with the glass, with the taste, with the man who had stepped back and allowed the moment to belong to them, and she found herself replaying it. Not the action itself, but the absence of pressure, the way he had not insisted, had not watched them with expectation, and that absence created a space she had not known existed, a space where choice felt real again, not assigned, not forced, and she picked another piece of cotton, placing it into the sack at her side, the fabric rough against her arm, the heat rising steadily as the sun climbed higher, now well past noon, the kind of heat that pressed into your back and stayed there, but even that felt slightly less oppressive than before, as if something inside her had shifted just enough to change how everything else was received, a small difference, but noticeable if you paid attention, and she did, she always paid attention. Beside her Elsa worked in silence, but there was a subtle change in her posture, less rigid, less guarded, and once, just once, she glanced toward the porch where Thomas had returned, not staring, just a brief look, then back to her work, and Anna noticed that too, the way one moment could ripple outward into others without announcement, without effort, and across the field the younger girl who had almost collapsed earlier moved more steadily now, her steps more certain, her hands less hesitant, as if the simple act of being given something without condition had reminded her body how to exist without constant fear, and the afternoon carried on, the sounds returning in layers, insects, wind brushing lightly through leaves, the distant creak of wood from the farmhouse, all of it blending into something that felt almost ordinary, and that was the strangest part of all, not the drink, not the taste, but the sense of normalcy that followed, fragile but present, and Anna realized that this was what she had missed most, not comfort, not even safety, but the quiet rhythm of a moment that did not demand anything from her beyond being in it. And she worked through another row, then another, the sack growing heavier at her side, the sun beginning its slow descent, and when the break came again, no one announced it, they simply paused, stepping back from the rows, wiping their hands against their clothes, and this time, when Anna looked toward the porch, she saw the glasses again, not new ones, not replaced, just the same set, waiting in the same place, and Thomas stood there once more, not calling them, not gesturing, just present. And for a second, the memory of earlier returned, not as tension, but as recognition, and Anna did not hesitate this time, she walked forward with the others, not quickly, not eagerly, but without that invisible resistance that had held her back before, and as she reached for the glass again, her hand steady, she understood something that had not been clear until now, that the first moment had not been about the drink at all, it had been about the possibility that not every gesture in this place was meant to take something from her, and that possibility, small as it was, had already begun to change the way she moved through the world. This time the distance closed faster, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because something inside them had already shifted, and Anna felt it the moment. Her fingers wrapped around the glass again, the coolness no longer foreign, no longer unexpected, just present, and she lifted it without hesitation, not as a test, not as a question, but as a simple continuation of something that had already begun, and around her the others did the same, no whispers now, no warnings, just quiet movement, each of them stepping into the moment with a little less resistance than before. And the field seemed to respond in its own way, the air moving slightly, a faint breeze passing through the rows, carrying the scent of earth and something sweet from the porch, blending together until it was impossible to separate one from the other, and Anna took a longer sip this time, letting the taste settle fully, not analyzing it, not comparing it to anything else, just allowing it to exist as it was, and she noticed how her body responded differently, not tense, not cautious, but steady, grounded, as if the simple act of choosing had restored something she had not realized was missing, and she lowered the glass, glancing briefly at Elsa, who met her eyes for a second, not smiling, but softer somehow, the edges of her expression less defined, and that was enough, no words needed, because whatever had passed between them earlier had already been understood, and across from them Thomas shifted slightly, adjusting his stance, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just remaining present in the same quiet way he had from the beginning, and Anna found herself noticing small details she had not seen before, the way his shirt sleeves were rolled just below the elbows, the faint lines on his hands, the stillness in his posture that did not come from stiffness but from intention, and it occurred to her that he had been watching them all along, not with suspicion, not with control, but with a kind of patience that required no explanation, and that realization settled into her differently than anything else had so far, because patience was not something she associated with this place, with this situation, with any part of the past months, and yet here it was, standing quietly in front of her, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, and she took another sip, slower this time, and for a moment she allowed herself to look beyond the immediate, beyond the field, beyond the day, imagining what it would mean if this was not an exception, if this was not a single isolated moment but part of something larger, something she could not yet define, and the thought did not frighten her the way it might have before, it simply existed, like the taste on her tongue, like the air moving around her, and she realized that this was how change began, not with declarations or dramatic shifts, but with something small, almost invisible. A decision made quietly, a boundary crossed without announcement, and as the last of the drink settled into the bottom of the glass, she did not rush to finish it, did not cling to it, she simply held it for a second longer, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it, before lowering it again, and when she looked up this time, her gaze did not search for confirmation, did not question, it simply met his, steady and unguarded for a brief moment, and in that exchange, something else became clear, something that had been building beneath the surface since the first sip, that whatever this was, it was no longer about understanding the difference between what they had expected and what they had found, it was about deciding what to do with that difference now that it was real. The afternoon did not announce its turning point, it arrived quietly, the way light begins to soften without asking permission, and Anna felt it not in the sky, but in herself, in the way her movements no longer carried that constant edge of readiness, the way her breath came easier between each row, and as the work continued, something else began to emerge, not spoken, not planned, but present in the small details that had once gone unnoticed, Elsa humming under her breath for a few seconds before stopping, as if surprised by the sound, the younger girl wiping her hands and looking up at the horizon instead of down at the ground, even the rhythm of their steps shifting slightly, less rigid, less mechanical, and Anna recognized it for what it was. Not comfort, not yet, but the beginning of something that made room for it, and she wondered if he noticed too, if Thomas saw the difference he had made without ever claiming it, and when she glanced toward the porch again, she found him in the same place. But not entirely the same, because now she could see the pattern in his stillness, the way he gave space instead of filling it, the way he allowed moments to unfold without interruption, and that understanding changed the way she looked at him, not as a figure of authority, not even as an individual separate from the role he held, but as something more specific, a man who chose restraint when he could have chosen control, and that choice carried weight in a world where most choices had been taken away, and as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the field, the heat easing just enough to be noticed, the women gathered their tools without being told, moving back toward the edge of the field where the break would come again, and this time there was no hesitation in their steps, no invisible barrier to cross, just the quiet continuation of what had already been accepted. And Anna walked at the front without realizing it, her pace steady, her posture unchanged but somehow lighter, and when she reached the porch, she did not stop at a distance, she stepped closer, not close enough to challenge, but close enough to remove that last layer of separation that had defined the earlier moments, and she set her empty glass down gently beside the others, the faint sound of it touching wood marking the end of something and the beginning of something else, and for a second she remained there, not turning away immediately, not retreating back into the safety of distance, and Thomas looked at her then, directly, without shifting his stance, without changing his expression, and in that brief exchange, there was no need for translation, no need for shared language, because the meaning had already been established in actions, in silence, in the simple fact that neither of them had forced the moment to become more than it was, and Anna gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, not a gesture of submission, not gratitude in the way it might be expected, but acknowledgment, clear and deliberate, and then she turned, stepping back toward the others, who were already waiting, already understanding without asking what had passed, and as they moved away from the porch together, the field behind them, the house to their side, the sky opening wider above, Anna realized that the day had divided itself into two parts, not by time, not by event, but by something quieter, something internal, the moment before and the moment after, and she did not know yet what that would mean for tomorrow, or the next day, or any of the days that would follow, but she knew this, that whatever came next would no longer be shaped entirely by what she had been told to expect, because now she had seen something else, something that did not erase the past, but stood beside it, asking to be considered, asking to be remembered, and that was enough to change the way the world felt, even if nothing in it had visibly changed at all. Evening did not fall all at once, it unfolded slowly across the field, the harsh white of the afternoon fading into something softer, something that allowed shadows to stretch and breathe, and Anna felt the change not just in the light, but in the rhythm of everything around her, the way the air cooled just enough to notice, the way the sounds shifted from sharp and constant to low and spaced out, as if the land itself was exhaling after holding its breath all day, and the women moved back toward the truck without being told, their steps no longer heavy with the same weight they had carried that morning, still tired, still worn, but different, and Anna walked among them, not leading, not following, just present in the space they shared, her hands empty now, her mind quieter than it had been in a long time. And as they reached the edge of the field, she turned once, not out of habit, but because something in her wanted to see it again, the porch, the rows, the place where something small had shifted into something lasting, and Thomas was still there, not in the same position, not exactly, but close enough, standing near the railing, one hand resting lightly against the wood, watching the field in that same steady way, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance, not long, not enough to draw attention, just a brief recognition that did not need to be held, and Anna looked away first, not out of hesitation, but because the moment had already completed itself, and she stepped up into the truck with the others, the wood creaking under their weight, the faint smell of dust and fabric rising as they settled into place, and no one spoke right away, not because there was nothing to say, but because they did not yet know how to say it, and the engine started, a low rumble that carried them away from the field, the landscape moving slowly past them as the light continued to fade, and Anna watched it without focusing on any single point, her thoughts moving in the same quiet way as the road beneath them, and beside her Elsa shifted slightly, then said her name. Once, softly, Anna, and when Anna turned, Elsa did not ask a question, did not explain, she simply held her gaze for a second, then nodded, a small gesture, but clear, and Anna returned it just as simply, because there was nothing more to add, the understanding already shared between them, and the truck carried them farther from the field, the farmhouse growing smaller behind them, the porch disappearing into the distance. And yet the moment did not feel like it was being left behind, it felt like it was being carried with them, quiet and steady, settling into memory without resistance, and as the sky deepened into shades of blue and gray, the first hint of evening settling over the road, Anna leaned back slightly, her body finally allowing the full weight of the day to rest, and she closed her eyes for just a second, not to sleep, not to escape, but to hold on to the feeling that had followed her from that single glass, that single moment of choice, and she understood now that what had happened was not something that would be spoken about easily, not something that would be written down in reports or explained in simple terms, it was something that would remain where it belonged, in the quiet space between what had been expected and what had actually occurred, and as the truck continued forward into the evening, carrying them toward whatever waited next, Anna realized that tomorrow would come as it always did, with the same heat, the same work, the same uncertainty, but it would not arrive unchanged, because she would meet it differently, not with less caution, not with blind trust, but with the knowledge that even in a place defined by conflict, there could exist moments that did not ask anything from her except to be seen for what they were, and that knowledge, small as it seemed, had already begun to change the way she understood everything around her. The camp returned to silence the way a room settles after a door closes, slowly, without announcement, and Anna stepped down from the truck with the others, her boots meeting the packed dirt with a dull, familiar sound, the air cooler now but still carrying the heat of the day like a memory that had not yet faded, and the barracks stood ahead of them in long, simple lines, unchanged, waiting, and for a moment it felt as if nothing had happened at all, as if the entire day had folded itself back into routine, into structure, into the quiet repetition that defined every hour here, and yet as Anna walked, she noticed the difference not in the place, but in the way she moved through it, the way her shoulders did not tighten as quickly, the way her eyes lifted instead of staying fixed on the ground, small things, almost invisible, but real, and inside the barracks the air held the scent of wood and fabric, familiar, contained, and the women settled into their spaces without speaking much, each of them carrying something they did not yet know how to share. Elsa sat on the edge of her bunk, unlacing her boots slowly, her movements deliberate, as if stretching the moment just a little longer, and the younger girl lay back without removing hers at all, staring up at the ceiling as if replaying something only she could see, and Anna remained standing for a second, her hand resting lightly against the frame of the bunk, grounding herself in the present, and she realized that what she felt was not relief, not exactly, but a kind of quiet awareness, the sense that something had shifted inside her and had not shifted back, and that permanence was both unfamiliar and steadying at the same time, and she sat down slowly, the wood firm beneath her, and reached for the small notebook she kept tucked beneath her things, not because she intended to write everything down, but because sometimes holding it was enough, a reminder that thoughts could exist outside of her mind, that moments could be captured in ways that did not require explanation, and she opened it without looking at the previous pages, her fingers pausing for a second before moving, and when she began to write, the words came slowly, not in full sentences, not in descriptions, just fragments, simple and precise. Cold glass, no words, he drank first, and she stopped there, not because there was nothing more, but because anything beyond that would feel like adding something that had not been there, and she closed the notebook gently, placing it back where it belonged, and leaned back slightly, her gaze drifting toward the small window where the last light of the day slipped through, soft and fading, and she thought about tomorrow, not with the same weight as before, not with the same certainty of what it would bring, but with something quieter, something that allowed for the possibility that it might not be exactly the same, and across the room Elsa glanced at her once, then looked away, but the glance was enough, a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken, and the room settled further, the sounds diminishing until only the faint creak of wood and distant night insects remained, and Anna closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to hold on to the feeling that had followed her from the field, that small, steady shift that had not asked for anything and yet had changed everything in a way she was only beginning to understand, and as the last of the light disappeared, leaving the room in shadow, she realized that whatever had begun out there had not ended when they left, it had come with her, quiet and unspoken. Waiting to see what she would do with it next. The night did not bring immediate rest, it brought stillness, the kind that made every small sound more noticeable, the creak of wood as someone shifted on a bunk, the distant hum of insects beyond the walls, the faint movement of air through the narrow window, and Anna lay there with her eyes open, not staring at anything in particular, just aware of her breathing, of the space around her, of the quiet that had settled over the room, and for a while she did not think, not in words, not in memories, just in sensations, the weight of the day still present in her body, the warmth lingering in her skin, and then slowly, without effort, the images returned, not in sequence, not in full, but in fragments, the glass in her hand, the foam rising, the moment he drank first, and she noticed something different now, something she had not fully understood before. It was not just what he had done, it was what he had chosen not to do. He had not watched them closely, had not waited for their reaction, had not stepped forward to guide or explain, and that absence had created a space where her decision had been entirely her own, and that realization settled deeper than the memory itself, because it changed the meaning of it, turned it from an act into something else, something that respected a boundary she had not realized she still possessed, and she shifted slightly on the bunk, the wood firm beneath her, and turned her head toward the window, where the darkness outside held no shape, only depth, and she wondered, briefly, what had led him to that choice, not out of curiosity about him as a person, but about the decision itself, because choices like that did not happen by accident. They came from something learned, something believed, and she found herself considering the possibility that his understanding of them was not as simple as she had assumed, that perhaps he saw them not only as prisoners, not only as labor, but as something more complicated, something that required a different kind of response, and the thought did not come with comfort, it came with a quiet tension, because if that were true, then it asked something of her in return, not action, not change, but acknowledgment, and acknowledgment was more difficult than resistance, because it required her to see clearly what stood in front of her, and as she lay there, listening to the slow rhythm of the room, she realized that the day had not only changed how she viewed him, it had changed how she viewed herself, not in any obvious way, not in something she could explain to the others or even to herself in simple terms, but in the sense that she had made a choice that had not been dictated by fear or expectation, and that choice, small as it was, had reminded her that she was still capable of deciding something for herself, and that realization carried weight, not heavy, but steady, like a foundation she had not known was still intact, and she closed her eyes then, not because she was tired, but because the thought had reached its natural end, and in the quiet that followed, she did not try to hold on to the moment or define it further, she simply allowed it to remain as it was, unfinished, unresolved, and as sleep began to settle in slowly, she understood that whatever came next would not need to repeat what had happened today. It would only need to acknowledge that it had happened at all, and that would be enough to make tomorrow different. Even if everything else remained exactly the same. Morning arrived without announcement, the way it always did, light filtering slowly through the narrow window, soft at first, then steady, filling the room inch by inch until shadows had nowhere left to stay, and Anna opened her eyes before the others stirred, not suddenly, not with urgency, but with a quiet awareness that had followed her through the night. And for a moment she remained still, listening, the room holding. That early silence that exists just before movement begins, the faint breath of air, the distant sound of something outside shifting into the day, and she noticed that her body did not tighten the way it usually did upon waking. There was no immediate return of that guarded readiness, no sharp awareness of where she was and what it meant. Instead there was a pause, a space that allowed her to arrive in the moment without resistance. And she sat up slowly, her feet touching the floor, the wood cool against her skin, grounding, real, and across the room Elsa turned slightly on her bunk, eyes opening, meeting Anna's for a second before looking away, not out of avoidance, but because nothing needed to be confirmed, and one by one the others began to wake, small movements, quiet sounds, the rhythm of the morning rebuilding itself piece by piece, and Anna moved through it as she always had, adjusting her clothes, tying her laces, preparing for the day ahead, but there was a difference in the way she did it, not in the actions themselves, but in the absence of something that had once been constant, that underlying tension that shaped every movement, every breath, and as they stepped outside, the air greeted them already warm, the sun rising steadily, promising another long day, another repetition of the same work, the same patterns, and yet it did not feel entirely the same, because she was not approaching it in the same way, and the truck waited where it always did, engine idling softly, and they climbed in without speaking much, settling into their places as the vehicle began to move, the road unfolding ahead of them in familiar lines, dust lifting behind the wheels, and Anna watched it without focusing on the destination, because she already knew where they were going, what waited there. And yet there was something else now, something that had not been there before, not expectation, not anticipation, but a quiet recognition that the place they were returning to was not exactly what it had been, and that realization did not come from anything visible, it came from the memory she carried, from the moment that had altered her understanding in a way that could not be undone, and as the field came into view, stretching out under the morning light, unchanged in its shape, unchanged in its purpose, Anna felt that same steady awareness settle into her again, not heavy, not distracting, just present, and when the truck came to a stop, and they stepped down onto the ground, the heat already beginning to rise from the earth, she did not hesitate, did not pause at the edge of the field the way she might have before, she moved forward with the others, her steps even, her posture unchanged but somehow more certain, and as she reached the first row, her hands already moving into the familiar rhythm, she allowed herself one brief glance toward the porch, not searching, not expecting, just acknowledging, and whether he was there or not did not matter in the same way it might have before, because the significance of what had happened no longer depended on its repetition, it existed on its own, complete, and as she turned back to her work, the day unfolding ahead of her, she understood that whatever this place would ask of her, whatever it would bring, she would meet it with that same quiet awareness, not defined only by what she had been told to believe, but shaped, in part, by what she had seen for herself, and that was enough to carry forward into whatever came next. The work began the same way it always did, hands moving into rhythm. Before thought could catch up, cotton pulled, gathered, dropped into the sack, step forward, repeat, the pattern steady, almost predictable, and yet something beneath it had shifted in a way that did not interrupt the routine but altered how it was carried, and Anna felt it in the way her attention moved, not fixed only on the ground in front of her, but lifting occasionally, noticing the edges of things, the line of trees in the distance, the slow movement of clouds overhead, the quiet presence of the porch off to the side, and when she glanced there this time, he was not there, not immediately, just the empty boards, the railing catching the morning light, and she held that image for a second before returning to her work, because the absence did not undo anything, it simply existed, another part of the day, and the hours moved forward, the sun rising higher, the heat building again, pressing into their backs, into the air around them, and the field returned to its familiar intensity, the kind that narrowed focus, that demanded consistency, and still, the difference remained, subtle but present, like a note that continued beneath the surface of everything else, and around her the others worked in the same quiet way, but there were small signs, Elsa pausing once to stretch her hands before continuing, the younger girl adjusting her pace without hesitation, movements that suggested something had eased, not disappeared, but loosened just enough to be felt, and Anna recognized it as the continuation of what had begun the day before, not repeating itself, not recreating the same moment, but extending it into something that could exist without being reenacted. And as the morning reached its peak, when the heat was strongest and the air seemed to hold still again, she became aware of a sound that did not belong to the field, the faint creak of wood, the shift of weight, and when she looked up, he was there, not in the center of attention, not calling out. Just present again, standing near the porch with the same quiet steadiness, and there was no announcement, no signal that anything would happen as it had before, no tray, no glasses, just the simple fact of his presence, and Anna noticed how that changed the moment, not because it brought expectation, but because it did not. It allowed the day to remain what it was while still carrying what it had become, and she returned her gaze to the work, her hands continuing without pause, because this was not about waiting for something to happen again, it was about understanding that it had already happened, and that was enough. And as the break came, unspoken as always, the women stepped back from the rows, moving toward the edge of the field. But this time there was no shared glance toward the porch, no quiet tension about what might be waiting. They simply walked, their movements unforced, and Anna followed, her pace even, her mind clear in a way that did not require explanation, and when she reached the shade, she sat down without hesitation, resting her hands against her knees, feeling the heat slowly leave her skin, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not to escape, but to settle into the space she had created for herself, a space that did not depend on what would or would not happen next. And when she opened them again, she did not look toward him immediately, she looked at the others, at the way they sat, the way they breathed, the way they existed in that moment without the same weight they had carried before, and only then did she glance toward the porch, and when their eyes met briefly, there was no need for acknowledgment, no need for repetition, because both of them understood something that had already been established, that the moment had not been about the drink, or even about that single day, it had been about the choice to allow something different to exist, and that choice did not need to be made again in the same way to remain real, it only needed to be remembered, carried forward in the quiet way that true things often are, without display, without insistence, simply present, shaping everything that followed in ways that could not always be seen, but could always be felt. The day did not end with anything dramatic, no final gesture, no repeated offering, no moment that asked to be remembered more than the others. It simply moved forward the way days always did, the sun lowering, the heat easing, the work coming to a natural close as the rows thinned and the light softened, and Anna stood for a second at the edge of the field, her hands empty, her breath steady, feeling the quiet shift from effort to stillness, and around her the others gathered without speaking, their movements familiar now, unforced, shaped by something that had settled into them without needing to be named. And when she looked toward the porch one last time, Thomas was there again, not watching closely, not waiting, just present in the same quiet way he had been from the beginning. And this time she did not search for meaning in it, did not measure the distance or the difference, she simply saw it as it was, part of the place, part of the day, and she understood that what had passed between them no longer belonged to a single moment, it had become something that did not need to repeat itself to remain real, and she turned away without hesitation, stepping toward the truck with the others, the wood creaking under their weight as they climbed in, the engine starting with a low, steady sound, and as they pulled away, the field receded behind them, unchanged in its shape, unchanged in its purpose, and yet not entirely the same, because she was not the same person leaving it as the one who had arrived, and she did not need to explain that to herself, did not need to define it in clear terms. She felt it in the way her thoughts moved, in the absence of that constant edge, in the quiet understanding that something had shifted and had stayed, and the road stretched ahead of them, dust rising in soft clouds behind the truck, the sky beginning to deepen as evening approached, and Anna leaned back slightly, her gaze moving across the landscape without settling on any one point, and she realized that what mattered was not whether moments like that would happen again, not whether the same gesture would be repeated or expanded or explained. What mattered was that it had happened at all, that in a place defined by structure and distance, there had been a moment that allowed for something else, something that did not demand, did not take, did not impose, and that moment had revealed something she had almost forgotten, that even within boundaries, even within roles assigned by war and circumstance, there could still exist choices that belonged entirely to the individual, and as the truck carried them back toward the camp, the light fading, the air cooling, she closed her eyes for a brief second, not to hold on to the past, but to settle into the present, and when she opened them again, she did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that needed to be reclaimed. It had already become part of her, part of the way she would move forward from this point on, and she understood, without needing to say it, that the quiet moments were the ones that endured, not because they were large or obvious, but because they changed something fundamental without asking for recognition, and as the road continued beneath them, steady and unbroken, she carried that understanding with her, not as a conclusion, not as an answer, but as something simpler and more lasting, a standard she had not spoken, but had chosen, and would not forget.